to Simon Mabon, who is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University and director of the Richardson Institute, which is the first and oldest peace and conflict centre in the UK. Today, Simon will be talking about desectarianisation and whether it is a new path for peace building. So thank you all for coming, and I will hand over to Simon. And I think a few more people might join as we go. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and then you can share your screen, Simon.
Sure. Okay. Does that come through okay? Is that everyone can see? Excellent. Well, in which case, thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk with you all today. Jade, thank you. It really means a lot to be invited here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing recently, which I'm hoping speaks to some of the types of things that some of you are interested in with regard to peace building. And the title of my talk is around the idea of this concept called desectarianisation, which is a rather new concept that has initially been applied to the Middle East. But what we're starting to do in the Richardson Institute and in some of the work that I'll tell you about in a minute is look at the ways in which this concept actually can be applied elsewhere beyond the region. Because what we're realizing is that with the increasingly politicized and in many ways securitized role of identity politics, it's important to figure out ways of figuring out how people can live alongside each other whilst acknowledging difference. And that's something that we're seeing a lot of in the Middle East with the rise of sectarianism, sector-based difference. And so we're trying to use the context of sectarian politics across the Middle East as a way of exploring some of these things, but supplementing our exploration on the Middle East with some non-Middle Eastern case studies. So we'll be looking at developments in the Balkans, for instance, with a particular focus on Bosnia. We will look at the case of Northern Ireland and sectarian tensions there between Protestant and Catholic. So a non-Muslim case of sectarianism, and then also look at India as well. So there we have a non-religious form of sectarianism with difference along caste lines. And fundamentally, what it is that we're trying to do here is explore alternative ways of peace building, alternative ways of figuring out how to build peace in divided societies, figuring out how we can mitigate and reduce some of the tensions that play out between communal groups in particular societies. So that's what it is that we're really trying to do. And I say we because I'm not referring to me as a royal we, but I'm leading a research project that's received funding from Carnegie Corporation based in the US. And one of the things that we've done with that money is set up SEPAD, which is the Sectarianism, Proxies and Desectarianisation Project, which brings together a range of academics based around the world, essentially, so kind of similar to this call, bringing together academics who are specialists in a range of different fields to try and push the boundaries of intellectual discussion about peace building and communal difference. And this includes scholars working on the Middle East, but it also includes a number of people working on the Balkans, India, and Northern Ireland. And we've had some really interesting sets of discussions around peace building here, and peace building in different contexts, and peace building in non-Western contexts in particular, because I think there's a certain set of assumptions around peace building that we see in Western contexts that doesn't always necessarily apply when you try and implement those types of strategies in the non-Western world, let's say. So that's what it is that I'm trying to do, and we're trying to do with the Richardson Institute and SEPAD. Look at the ways in which identity and communal difference in a vitriolic way can be mitigated. And predominantly we're focusing on religious identity, but it doesn't just relate to religion, of course. And if we were to talk about sectarianism in the Middle East, for instance, it would obviously relate to Sunni and Shia. But when you start broadening out that exploration, well, it leads to questions about the role of ethnic identities, the role of national identities, the role of governance, the role of politics, the role of sovereign power, the processes through which life is regulated. And it quickly becomes apparent that this isn't about sectarianism in the traditional way in which you would view sectarianism. So a sort of quote unquote ancient hatreds between one sect and another. Now, in the case of Islam, this is supposedly dates back to the 7th century and the Battle of Karbala, which pitted two opposing blocks within the nascent Islamic world against one another over leadership of the burgeoning caliphate. So that initial moment of schism was political, but in the years after, it's been framed as theological. But what we're seeing is that this is as much about politics and the regulation of life as it is about religion. And that it's about the ways in which these identities, religious identities, have been mobilized in the context of political difference, political challenges, particular agendas, etc., etc. And in the case of the Middle East, there's been a lot of work done recently on this process of sectarianization. And what sectarianization does is it suggests that religious identities are used instrumentally by elites who seek to deploy them, mobilize them for their own interests. So, for instance, you would get, say, a Sunni in Iran, for instance, who could be mobilized by the rhetoric, the speeches, the financial support of actors in Saudi Arabia, let's say, just hypothetically, because of Saudi interest in causing unrest in Iran, and vice versa. So you get elites mobilizing particular groups for political ends. That's the sectarianization thesis, and it's predicated on this one assumption that sectarian difference is constructed in accordance with political ends and political aspirations. So working on that assumption then, that sectarian difference is constructed, if it can be deconstructed, then we're wanting to explore if it can be deconstructed. So if it can be constructed, can it be deconstructed? That's the real crux of what it is that we're interested in, because we argue that if sectarian difference has been constructed and it's led to violent repression, it's led to authoritarianism, it's led to hundreds of thousands of deaths directly and indirectly across the Middle East, close to 10 million people being displaced from their homes, then there's a pretty strong argument to say that there needs to be a deconstruction of that vitriolic enmity. So if that's the case, then what does it look like? How do we understand those processes through which a desectarianization can occur? Where does it play out? Who does it play out between? Who's involved? Things like that. There's a lot of questions that have cropped up in terms of actually trying to understand what it is that we're doing. And this, I thought, was summed up quite nicely when I did an Ecosia image search for desectarianization. And literally nothing came up when I wrote this presentation. And I thought that summed it up quite nicely, that there's not really any understanding of desectarianization. There's certainly no academic consensus. And that, I think, is a bit of a problem, because when we're wanting to understand these processes, we need to conceptualize them. We need to figure out not only what is it about and the empirical issues that are at play, but how to actually understand the ways in which these processes play out. Because once we understand that, then we can start to reflect on the various stages involved in the processes and test these processes in different contexts. So take what we found in the Middle East and apply it to Northern Ireland, or learn about the experiences of Northern Ireland and apply it to India, for instance. So there's a lot of questions that start to come up, but fundamentally, on the basis of 2 years of work now, what we're thinking desectarianization broadly to be is the renegotiation, the reimagining of the role of identities within life. Now, it sounds a bit amorphous, a bit transient perhaps. But that's intentional, because what it is wanting to do is create scope for people to reposition themselves vis-a-vis the other, vis-a-vis the state. Not necessarily bring about immediate reconciliation, not necessarily bring about an immediate transformation, but to reimagine how they see themselves, how they position themselves against the other. And that reimagining can create opportunities for a process of desectarianization. So that's what we're talking about here, this renegotiation of the role of religion, renegotiation of the role of identity, or the reimagination of religious identities, or broadly speaking, particular identities. But that immediately leads to questions of, well, who is involved and where does it take place? There are some who would define it in different terms. So, for instance, the protests that took place across Lebanon and Iraq, late 2019, early 2020, some people would say they're post-sectarian or anti-sectarian, but I would argue that they are, and I can maybe pick this up in the Q&A, but they are slightly problematic terms because they are limited in scope, and they are, by their very nature, closing themselves off to other people who don't necessarily agree with that understanding, but agree with the broader aim. So that's why we use desectarianization as a broad umbrella term. But in terms of who's involved, I guess there's two main sets of approaches. One is a top-down approach and one is a bottom-up approach. And typically we would imagine desectarianization, I think, to be bottom-up. We've seen the widespread protests playing out across the Middle East, playing out in a range of different contexts across the world, I guess, in 2020, whereby people have sought to reimagine their relationship with regard to identity and the state. And with the protests of 2011 across, say, Bahrain, for instance, in the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, we saw Bahrainis take to the streets and say, I'm not Sunni, I'm not Shia, I'm just Bahraini, which to me seems like a clear effort at desectarianization. We saw in Lebanon in 2015 and 2019, in Iraq in 2019, efforts to say all of them means all of them. We want to overthrow this entire sectarian system. We've had enough, khalas, we've had enough of the sectarian system. So it seems that there's a very clear bottom-up dimension to it. But there's also a top-down process at play as well. And one of the really prominent examples, I think, is in the case of Saudi Arabia, whereby in recent years, we've seen Mohammed bin Salman trying to reduce tensions within the kingdom between Sunni and Shia, and try and generate this sense of a Saudi nationalism, bringing people together under a shared Saudi history that privileges national identity over sectarian identity. So there's both top-down and bottom-up. There's normatively more positive types of things going on in terms of popular protests with particular agendas that speak for large numbers of people. And then there's top-down imposition of power types of processes. So I think it's important just to be aware of those two different sets of questions and debates. But in terms of location, I think this is equally important, because these aren't just taking place online. These aren't just amorphous sets of protests that don't have a resonance across the world. They play out in a range of different ways, depending on the context, depending on the peculiarities of time and space. They play out online recently as a consequence of COVID, but they've also played out across the formal and informal spaces of a particular state. They play out in the political realm. They play out through formal political channels, the sort of civil society spaces that have been carved open by a state, by ruling elites. So democratic processes, let's say, through political parties, through NGOs, civil society organizations, charities. But in some cases, there isn't scope to do that. In some cases, there isn't scope because there is no civil society, there is no public space, there is no opportunity to express dissent. And as a consequence, it plays out in different ways. It plays out on the streets. And this is a photo I took in Bahrain 8 years ago now, I think. And it's a photo that shows, I think, well, it does a good job of showing the visible contestation playing out between all the different actors involved, writing in English, writing in Arabic, covering things up with graffiti, with images of those in prison, those martyred, trying to speak to the wider audiences, writing in English, of course, to even speak to an international audience because of the Formula One race that was due to take place there. So it plays out in different spaces. And those spaces, I think, are contingent on the type of politics that is playing out in a particular state. And there it's important to think about, well, what does that political system allow someone to do if they are wanting to express dissent, if they're wanting to express frustration at the status quo? And in some cases, they play out in the biopolitical or the governance strategies of the state. And this can be efforts to resist certain policies that have been put in place by government, by a ruling elite. In some cases, the ruling elite imposes particular strategies, particular policies, governance strategies on a state in an effort to desectarianize. But the very strategies that are being used, what someone like Michel Foucault called biopolitics, designed to regulate life, let life live, to facilitate control over that life, provide opportunities in which people can resist, in which people can try and renegotiate their position against the state, either by rejecting the role that these processes have to play, or co-opting them, or figuring out some way of trying to navigate in a way that reinforces a particular agenda. And I'll give you an example here, because I think this can be a little bit clunky, but in the case of Lebanon, for instance, which has some pretty draconian, pretty abhorrent laws over LGBTQ communities, what some activists have been trying to do is use the very governance strategies and laws of the state to make the state inoperable, to highlight the problems that they are facing and to bring attention to their cause. So when they've been arrested and brought before a judge, they're trying to use legal loopholes. They're trying to find favorable judges, favorable lawyers, and people that can support their cause to basically jam up the system, to make it so that the system can't function. And that's using the very governance strategies of the state against itself. So there's ways that people are turning the state and turning the very institutions and the mechanisms of the state against itself. So that it's actually quite creative, the types of ways in which people are mobilizing and the types of strategies that people are using to transform possible spaces of contestation in a way that suits their own purposes. Okay. But of course, this is conditioned by a whole host of different types of structural conditions. And again, these are contingent on time and place. And this is a photo that was taken in Lebanon in 2015 with the so-called "You Stink" crisis. And the "You Stink" crisis was the failure of governance stemming from bureaucratic failures rather than bottom-up efforts to make the process fail. Bureaucratic failures to collect trash, to collect rubbish from the streets of Beirut. And I'm sure you can imagine in sort of 30-degree heat, when you've got piles of rubbish sitting out on the street, there's a pretty horrendous smell very quickly emerging. And it prompted people to take to the streets, calling for political reform, calling for an end to the sectarian quota system that allows particular groups to have a prominent say in the running of the state. And this movement, called the "You Stink" movement, brought hundreds of thousands of people to the streets of Lebanon calling for change. And that stems from the frustration with the political system. The political system that gave, is the power sharing agreement that gave each communal group in Lebanon a proportional share of the vote in the political system. And it's the same in Iraq, where different communal groups get a proportion of the vote and get a proportion of the seats in the chamber, for instance. So political systems are really important because they go some way to conditioning the scope that actors have to facilitate change. And then there's socioeconomic forces as well. And this, I think, plays a really big role in both driving people to the streets and pulling them off the streets in terms of the various pressures that people are facing to be able to feed their families. Socioeconomic forces and contexts are really key, either in pushing people to protest or preventing them from doing so because of the dire need for feeding families, etc. I've talked a bit about governance, so I'll skip over this. And I guess governance is tied up with ideas of a social contract. But I think a social contract's important here because the ways in which a social contract is framed can privilege particular identities over others. And if it does that, then it goes some way to enshrining that difference, that particular form of difference in the way that citizenship plays out, in the way that politics plays out in that particular state. So I think it's worth reflecting on the structural factors within a social contract. For instance, in Lebanon, the divisions that are set out in the constitution, which sets out the terms of citizenship, the terms of political engagement, and it sets out who has the right to do what, where, when, and how. So social contracts actually have a really important role to play here because they serve to reinforce difference or to enshrine it, not only within the informal aspects of a social contract, but also within the formal tools of a constitution, let's say. So one of the things that we've been doing is working with some constitutional lawyers to think about the ways in which constitutional reform can work to create more inclusive forms of identity that don't just privilege, say, sect or particular identities and cultivate those divisions against the other. So that's one of the strategies that we're trying to work through with regard to social contracts and constitutions. But this all plays out within the context of geopolitics. And you might be wondering now why on earth I had a map of Saudi Arabia and Iran at the start of this presentation. And that's because within the context of the Middle East, much of what takes place, particularly in the states that are divided societies with divisions playing out along sectarian lines, are conditioned by geopolitical factors. They're conditioned by the types of influence that Riyadh and Tehran are able to exert over those states. So for instance, the provision of support financially, the provision of ideological support, interpersonal relationships, the provision of foreign policy support, international cover, things like that, which in turn conditions the behavior of particular actors. And in Bahrain, of course, being such a close neighbor of Saudi Arabia and such a small neighbor with a very small population of just over 1.2 million and an incredibly small landmass that's about the size of Reading as a British city, which is not particularly big, then you get a sense of the demographic and geographic size disparities, along with the massive economic disparities. So if Saudi Arabia stipulates that the Bahrainis must do something to maintain their support, then there's little option, little space for agency for the Bahrainis to do something different. So there's all these other factors that are restricting the capacity of people to do things. It's not just the case of people are frustrated, so they go to the streets. And of course, in a couple of instances, you've also got all of this playing out in the context of war. So in the cases of Syria and Yemen, and previously Iraq, much more in the past Lebanon, there are added complexities and challenges pertaining to ongoing violent conflict. And that is a real issue. It's a live issue with regard to peace building in the Middle East. Figuring out how to get a ceasefire in some of these conflicts is hard enough, but then the lasting damage done by these devastating wars, not just on the infrastructure of the state, but on the physical and mental health of in those two states, the best part of what, 30 odd million people is huge. But it's also gone some way to enshrining difference and really sort of internalizing difference in the views of another. It's turning into an intergenerational set of conflicts along sect-based lines. So even if there is a way of bringing about a swift end to either conflict, the long-standing tensions between different communities that have been engaged in a vitriolic, deeply personal, and in many ways existential war or set of wars will be a really difficult thing to move beyond. Because this just isn't just a set of wars and conflicts about resources or access to resources that can be easily mediated against, but rather it's something that is almost existential, because it relates to identity, because it relates to a set of fundamental beliefs about claims to universal truth within religion. So it's quite challenging to even think about the post-conflict phase. And this is where someone like Jean-Paul Lederach would talk about conflict transformation, the idea of transforming the ideas that different groups have about the other. And rather than trying to bring about reconciliation, trying to transform the ways in which different communities view one another. But of course, that requires a very long time, and it requires a whole host of things to be addressed that are unique to particular conflicts. It requires access on a large scale to communal leaders, to individuals. It requires coordinated efforts that are easily thrown by spoilers, which means that there have to be perhaps different ways of thinking about peace building, which is why we're looking at this idea of desectarianization, which isn't to say that, look, as soon as this war's over, there will be a shift towards something much more positive, and that the different communal groups will relate to each other in a very positive way. That's not necessarily what desectarianization is about in the first instance, but rather it's about creating the scope to reposition the self against the other, not necessarily to mean that the other will become the best friend or incredibly positive right now, but to figure out ways of living with difference. I think that's the important point here. Figuring out ways of living with difference, but in a way that doesn't descend into something more dangerous, something more vitriolic. And that requires engaging with some of these structural factors. It requires engaging with the conditions that have given rise to this conflict, that have given rise to the different processes that have exacerbated difference, I guess. And those are challenges that aren't unique to the Middle East. They're challenges that have had to be addressed across the Balkans, across Northern Ireland, that will have to be addressed in India, that will probably have to be addressed in the United States, and obviously in many other places as well. But figuring out how to do that, how to learn to live with difference, I think is one of the key challenges. And it's not an easy thing to do, of course. It's not easy to just impose such tolerance. But I think creating the space to reimagine the relationship with the other is possible conceptually. And so that's where we're at with things. We don't claim to have a silver bullet solution to the problem, but hopefully we've got a few different ways of thinking about a problem or a set of problems that, through engaging with people across the world with different contexts, different conflicts, we can try and find ways of putting forward suggestions that can be tailored to those specific contexts and sets of divisions. And I think, Jade, that's where I'll leave it, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's really relevant to the work that we're doing at Asfar as well. Does anybody have any questions? You can either unmute yourself and say them, or if you feel more comfortable, you can put them in the chat for Simon. And while we wait for that, I have a question about whether the different sects, do you think sectarian communities can ever be separated from politics? Was my first question.
I think that depends who you ask, because if you ask someone like Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, he would say, look, religion has nothing to do with it. Religion isn't about politics. Religion and imams should stay out of politics, but that that should be left to the political elites. But then if you ask someone like the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he would say, look, religion and politics are intertwined, and in the absence of the Mahdi, you need someone who's clerically trained to provide this spiritual guidance and spiritual and political guidance, and to ensure that everything that is playing out in terms of a political system is done in accordance with God's will. So I think it depends who you ask. But I think my view is that religion has the capacity to be political, much like most other things. And sects have the capacity to be political as well. But I think that's conditioned by context. And if the context is right, then sects don't have to be political. They don't have to have political dimensions or political divisions. But if the context is wrong, then they will very quickly take on a political dimension, much like many, many other things. I don't think there's anything particularly unique in this case about a sect taking on a political dimension. I think most things can take on political dimensions if the circumstances and the context allow it.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions they can think of?
I have a question. I have a question about, so could you say that the whole like different sects and like differing beliefs living in one sort of society was kind of possible in the past, where, for example, like in India and Pakistan, when it was Hindustan, it was kind of the Muslim people and the Hindu people kind of lived in unity before obviously the British came to like colonize. So could you say that perhaps before that it was kind of possible, but obviously due to the effects of colonialism and sort of the British influence of, you know, Christianity and even the absence of Christianity, but just that sort of colonial kind of past could have kind of altered that peace within that society?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think colonialism has got a hell of a lot to answer for, obviously. British history has a hell of a lot to answer for. I would argue in terms of British history, we need to know a great deal more about our past and to critically engage with it and make sure students are taught about it, because when I look back on my education, my history classes, there was nothing on our colonial past, and that's a travesty and something that should not be allowed to happen. In terms of India and Pakistan, I think, yeah, there was a degree of tolerance and acceptance of the other. I think there were also divisions that played out that were perhaps to do with land, to do with resources, to do with power, to do with broader relationships with external actors that were trying to engage with with Hindustan at the time. So there were obviously British, French, Portuguese actors that were there trying to, well, get their own way with what was happening. But there were also different types of divisions playing out between different, if empire is the right word, I'm not sure, given the size of India. Different empires within India, there were different claims to power within India, different sets of divisions along caste lines within Hinduism, instances of Hindu-Muslim tensions intermittently across that period, tensions with with external actors that came in, be it the more recent British, French, Portuguese, or earlier Persians and others. So there's a whole host of different issues that play, I think. But there are, I think the point you're getting at, there are examples across history, be it the Indian case, or be it other cases across the Middle East or elsewhere, of members of different communities that have got very serious tensions at this point getting on with one another. There's not, I don't think it's, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is this history of coexistence. There is a history of coexistence between different communities and different communal groups that have often been framed as engaging in processes of quote unquote ancient hatreds, let's say. Barack Obama, when he was in power, said that the problem with the Middle East nowadays is this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is rooted in ancient hatreds dating back millennia. He was dating it back to the Battle of Karbala, of course, in the 7th century. But that, I think, is hugely inappropriate, and it misses the political, regional, economic, geopolitical rivalries that are shaping sort of more localized life across the region. So there is a rich history of coexistence, but that coexistence is also shaped and challenged by the peculiarities of time and space, which may allow for coexistence, but it may also put a dramatic end to that coexistence. If that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Does anybody else have any questions? I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting, the topic, and I think having moved to Bosnia and Herzegovina, when we would go traveling to other parts of the country, it was really interesting how split the country is on ethnic divisions. And I think something that I've noticed is that, especially in Sarajevo, where mostly people live not harmoniously in terms of politics, but there's people who have friends from different ethnic groups. They tend to get along a lot more, whereas outside in the more rural areas where they don't have a chance to meet others from different communities, I've seen a lot more separation in that sense. So I feel like something that I noticed as well in my thesis was that when people meet the other, they're often a lot more accepting of them, because I think, like you said in the presentation, there's a lot of preconceived ideas that people have of a group, especially when they don't know them. So I thought that was really interesting. And I don't know whether Amina or Shanice, you about the exchange in Cyprus that we did with the Greek and Turkish Cypriot groups, because I think that's really relevant to the topic.
Yes, so I can maybe, me being somebody who was born in Serbia, raised in Bosnia, for me to go to Cyprus was a real experience, because in my sense, we at the Balkans have all the problems on the world and nobody else has any kind of problems. But although we hear that Cyprus is a divided city, like in my mind, I was imagining it's divided simply like Bosnia in two entities, but you don't have real like lines and real borders which you can't really cross. So when we have done this youth exchange under our Resolve project, and when I arrived, and then I had issues first at the border at the Greek side of the island, like why am I going to stay and sleep in the Turkish side of the island? And I couldn't just say because it's cheaper, of course, but it's like, I just said that's where our hosts are putting us. I'm like, it's the first time I'm here. I don't know why and things like that. So, and then that you have to have your passport all the time with you every time you cross the border, and we were crossing like 10 times per day, was a real putting in my mind, just seeing that many other countries have different issues that we really don't hear about them. Although I know for my country we are really divided, and in many sense, although the war passed like 25 years ago, but there are still different things that, especially the government, is still dividing us in many census, and many political parties are really gaining power just by division of all the people and young people living here. And it seems they take pride in how many young people are leaving our country and not coming back, although they should do everything just to bring people back, not to okay, it's like 10,000 young people left, doesn't matter, who cares. So there are many different things, and I really agreed when you said in the beginning that socioeconomic needs can sometimes bring people together, because we really had this case in Bosnia in 2013, where big protests came along because of this. The government couldn't decide how they will give us those unique numbers that every citizen gets when they by birth, and they were like making an issue which number should get somebody who is born in one part of the country. It's really like a stupid thing, which made so many issues to babies who were born after that day, because they couldn't get a passport, so they couldn't go anywhere, which led to a case where a young girl died. Oof. It's like so many years ago, but it's still, I'm sorry. So just wanted to say that these protests brought the whole country together, and they enabled the government to see that people can here unite, and they will fight for those things which are important. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Amina. Does anybody else have anything?
Can I pick up on that just for a second, Jay, please? And really sorry to hear about that story, Amina. It's heartbreaking, really is. I found it interesting though when you were talking about the manipulation of different groups and the ways in which the political elites were causing division for their own interest, and to, if I understood you correctly, to secure power, basically creating division to secure power. But I wonder, to what extent then did the idea of sectarianization map onto what you witnessed there? Because even though it shares the hallmarks of instrumental manipulation of identities, did it resonate with what happened? And if it did, then, sorry, I guess this is a slightly unrelated question, but what was the response like to that from people then? Was there, you talked about these protests, did those protests actually resonate with those in power, or were they able to sort of circumvent the protests like we've seen across the Middle East largely, and those in power were largely able to reassert their self-interest and their survival?
What the protest brought was actually that I don't know how many thousand people were protesting. They encircled the parliament, so actually the people in the government couldn't exit the government for a few days until they said that they will make this new law so that everybody receives this unique number. So it was in a sense something very drastical, which never happened here before, and maybe in this sense will not happen again here. But it really brought together everybody, and nobody was anymore talking about who from where they belong or whatever. And on the protest, everybody was really on the protest. So people who with young kids, with babies were there, elderly people, students, so everybody united about this one cause, which was very important for citizens of the country.
And did anything come of that? Because that's a positive moment, I guess, that we've seen in somewhere like Lebanon in 2019, to a lesser extent Iraq as well, but in Lebanon in 2019, when everyone took to the streets, and there were probably millions on the streets of Lebanon, which tells you about with a population of maybe 6 million in total, the protests were huge across the whole state. But out of that set of protests, some new political parties were formed that were explicitly anti-sectarian. They said we are not forming along sectarian lines, but we are forming on issue-based agendas. So some people tried to capitalize on the protests and the energy and the momentum from that moment to establish new political parties and to generate support. And it's the same back in 2015 as well. But did that happen in this case, or was it just a moment of protest and then it all dissipated?
At that period, it really was just that moment.
Okay.
We now have in the local government some parties which are not in those sectorial lines. So they just the elections were just this last October. And so there was a change in the local government. So we still can't say if it was an improvement, like everybody really hopes. But until few months pass and we don't really see what they're working on and how they will work, we can't really say.
Thank you.
Thank you also.
Any other questions just before we finish?
I kind of have a small question. Simon, do you think that so from like in examples in the past, do you think like, for example, in like Palestine, when it was like back in the day, like around like the first beginning of Islam time, do you think that when everyone, like the Christians and the Jews and like the Muslims would all live like cohesively in Jerusalem, do you think that there's any like and different examples like that around the world? Do you think that we could like, how do you think that you would sort of present that in this whole desectarianization kind of concept? Do you think we could like learn from that or take any sort of like how we could go forward using those kind of examples? Like, I don't know.
I think you're right to say we need to look at history more, if that's what you're getting at. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not a historian, so my knowledge of Palestine in the formative stages of Islam is not great. I will hold my hands up and say that. But there are, of course, moments across history whereby different communities within one religion and across religions have lived together. I mean, there's so many examples of inter-sectarian marriage that takes place across the Middle East to this day. So many examples. There's so many examples of interfaith marriages taking place, secular marriages taking place. So that shows that, I mean, there are many opportunities for this type of thing to play out. There's many opportunities to explore these examples in the present. And one of the reasons why in our project we're looking at the Balkans, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and India is because we want to look at history. We want to look at what efforts have been put in place to facilitate peace building, to look at the historical experience, to look at the historical experience in the Middle East. There's a wonderful book being written by Osama Makdisi called The Age of Coexistence, which is talking about Lebanon and the way in which sectarian communities were working together, living together and coexisting in Lebanon prior to the presence of a colonial power, in this case the French. So there's many an example. But I think one of the other things that we really need to do, and I think this is really important, is stress and be very careful to stress, look, this isn't just about Islam. Because I think it's very easy to pick up that, oh, well, we're talking about Islam here, we're talking about Sunni Shiism, it's this ancient hatreds again. And as academics, we're obviously careful to make that more nuanced, but it's very easy to pick up on, oh, well, here's a project looking at sectarianism in the Middle East. It's all about Islam again. So I think it's very important to stress that sectarianism isn't just restricted to Islam. And you've mentioned Jerusalem. If I just give you an example here of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is one of the holiest sites in Christianity, and it's a allegedly the site on which Jesus was crucified, and they built a church around it, and it's a fascinating building. But because of the significance to Christianity, it's home to a lot of different Christian sects, Russian Orthodox, Armenian, Coptic, Greek Orthodox, and I'm sure there's a couple of others as well. And each of them has their own little area within the church. And they largely get on. They found a way of existing together, even though there's many different disputes, theological disputes, practical disputes over the church. There was a famous incident of a ladder being left in the rafters of the church because it was put there by someone who shouldn't have been putting it there, and now they don't have permission to get it down. But the most fundamental difference concerns who should have the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and which Christian sect should have the responsibility of opening and closing the church each day. And do you know which one has it? Anyone? No.
Isn't that some Muslim family?
It is.
I don't know the name, but
it was the Nusayris. It was given to a Muslim family because there were so many different tensions within the sectarian schisms within Christianity seen in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So I think it's really important that we stress that this isn't just a phenomenon unique to Islam. Particularly academics have to stress this, I think. Otherwise it risks further exacerbating sentiments of Islamophobia, etc., which we're doing our damnedest to try and counter in the UK right now. So yeah, history is really key. There are so many examples of coexistence across history, but also across the present as well. So I think it's worth trying to find all these different examples to try and draw on experience and see what lessons can be learned. But thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. I think it's a really, really interesting topic, and thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. If there's no more questions, then we can end the call. But just before you guys go, in 2 weeks, we will have a digital talk again with Chrissy Brown from Romblong, if I'm saying that right, Malcolm, the tutoring project. To watch this digital talk, it will be up on Wednesday, and to see all of our previous digital talks, it will be on our YouTube channel, which is Asfar. And thank you very much for everyone coming, and hopefully we'll see you all again in 2 weeks' time. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a safe day.
Thank you again for the invitation, everyone. It's been a pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.